So today we're going to have two incredible guests from both sides of the aisle. The aisles being Anthropic, former OpenAI, former Meta, and now Chai. Flow of class today, I'll make a quick introduction, but I'll hand it over to the speakers who will present about their work. They're all both doing very, very exciting work. And then we'll have some time for Q&A towards the end. So maybe without further ado, I'll quickly introduce our guests and have you guys over. Our first guest today is Kauderer-Abrams. Eric has the fun job of convincing all biology to run on Claude. He runs biology and life sciences at Anthropic, launched Claude for Life Sciences last October, and they've got some really good partnerships with Benchling, 10x Genomics, Novo, and I was just told that the last time you were here in this course was your final EE PhD scarred memory.
It was a device physics final. I'm still traumatized from it.
Good. Well, thanks for joining us. And then Josh, you've spent your whole career teaching computers to do biology. We missed you here at Stanford, but it's good to have you back. You were early at OpenAI, like early, like almost a decade ago at OpenAI. And then at Meta, built the first life sciences product, which is almost half of all citations today are citing your work with ESM1. You started Chai Discovery to make drug discovery an engineering problem, as you call it, the CAD suite for molecules. And you've raised from the who's who, from OpenAI, from Anthropic, from Thrive at a big price. So we're very excited to get into it. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. We'll start with you, Josh. And I got your slides if you wanted to use them.
Thank you.
Tell us about your journey. You know, you were not a pre-med major. You were not pursuing a medicine degree. How did you land up? How did you take the scenic road to Chai?
So it's actually not totally correct. I think I did all the pre-med classes. I thought I would be a doctor. I come from a family of doctors.
Right.
I have a bunch of older siblings who were already in medical school when I was a kid. So I wanted to do something different from them. So I learned how to code. Nice. And the thing that I loved about programming that I didn't really see you could do in medicine at the time was you could really distribute what you were doing, right? You could write a piece of code and then it was like infinitely scalable, right? You can just like send it to many people. And it was late in high school that I actually discovered biotech, and I realized that drugs actually had a similar property. It was another way to scale medicine and medical discoveries. So I've always liked coding more than the lab, but they're pretty linked, I think.
Nice. And tell us a little bit about your work at Chai. What do you guys do? And feel free to take a couple of minutes to walk us through it.
Yeah. So you put it beautifully. Like, we're building a computer-aided design suite for molecules at Chai. If you look at what's going to happen, see if these slides work. Yeah. So one of the things we're gearing up to, I'd say let's call it the medium term, because the long term is so much of the lab work that we do today is probably going to move on to the computer, and it's going to move as a kind of a goal that we can illustrate here. Is we want to be able to design antibody molecules. These are about half of the approved drugs these days are called antibodies. And there's a big trial and error process when you make a drug. You find some initial hit, you try to make a bunch of changes to it to get all these properties that you need for it to be a drug. And the big hypothesis is that someday we'll be able to just zero-shot these molecules that are ready for patients right out of the computer. So we started the company with this big goal, thinking that this was going to become possible, and that when it became possible, it would be a no-brainer for most people to design drugs this way. So when we started the company about 2.5 years ago, everyone told us we were crazy to do this. I mean, both because like, hey, is that technology going to work? And then B, don't you need to make your own drugs? The ambition of the most ambitious biotech companies is usually to become a pharma company. And then the ambition that we were taking was like, no, like we want most drugs to be designed this way, and we're not going to make most drugs ourselves. We really want to partner deeply with the ecosystem. So we had kind of two contrarian bets in one. So I'm grateful that we managed to get those good names on the cap table, like you mentioned. But I think that there's been a ton of progress since then.
Got it. So you would provide the CAD for molecules to a pharma business like AstraZeneca, like Pfizer, and so on.
That's right. Yeah. So some of the biggest pharma companies in the world are already using Chai's models in order to design their drugs.
Got it. Fascinating. Thank you. Eric, over to you, sir. Please tell us about your journey. You've started a couple of companies, ran a bunch of companies, and now at Anthropic. What are you up to?
Yeah, sure. So I originally was trained in math and physics, and then got into AI research the thread there was I thought that understanding intelligence was the great theoretical problem of our time. And then it was actually here in grad school, I was in Kwabena Bohen's lab, the Brains in Silicon lab, where starting as this arrogant physicist, I got my first taste of real biology as we were studying the brain to try to find principles to bring back to AI. It was love at first sight. I think ever since then, I've just gone deeper and deeper into the world of biology through the companies that I started, getting into molecular biology, biochemistry, organic chemistry. And after grad school, I had started several different medtech and biotech companies and have been kind of in this world ever since. And I think when I was running the last company, it was a molecular diagnostics company called Detect. And I was checking back in on what was happening in the AI world and seeing the very beginning of ChatGPT. And I'll never forget when Sonnet 3.5 came out, there was this step change in capabilities where I was asking it to do things that were coming up in my daily life of running a biotech company, of debugging some experiments that were failing in the lab and responding to FDA feedback and all sorts of things. And I was just shocked that it was useful at all back then. And it became very clear to me in that moment that this was a technology that we could use to accelerate the whole process end to end of doing R&D in the life sciences. And I think Josh and I have talked about this. What we're doing respectively, and I'll explain more in a moment, is complementary in that at Anthropic, what we want to do is figure out end-to-end how to accelerate the whole process of doing R&D in the life sciences. So this includes basic research, drug development, and within drug development, I think what Josh is doing is a big piece of the puzzle of actually designing the drug. But after that, there's a lot more. There's all of the clinical development, the regulatory processes, the transfer to manufacturing, right? And our vision is to train Claude to be able to do it all, right? So at the model training level, we have a full stack model training program to make Claude state of the art and meet or exceed human expert performance in everything that you can imagine. The hardcore scientific fields that underpin this, right, in bioinformatics and chemistry, in structural biology and so on, and the clinical and regulatory aspects of designing clinical trials and responding to regulatory feedback, even the strategic aspects of running a drug development program, so picking targets and modalities, organizing an R&D program, deciding when to advance or kill programs. So we're training the model to do all of those things. And beyond that, we believe it's not enough to have great frontier models. We also need to make sure that the model capabilities are accessible to people and integrated into workflows and connect to all the tools that you need. And so we also focus a lot on the product layer and making sure that we have products that are optimized for life science professionals. And we have, along those lines, something like a Claude Code for Bio that will be coming out fairly soon. That is our take on taking the power of Claude Code on the back end, but putting an interface on top of it that's designed for working scientists, right? So that you can visualize proteins and small molecules and play around with these things and have Claude know what you're talking about and spin up lots of compute to run lots of models like Chai and so on. So we focus a lot on the model layer and the product layer, and we consider those two things together to be the platform that we want to take and scale throughout the whole life science world to achieve our goal. And our goals here are to get this end-to-end order of magnitude or more acceleration on everything that's happening throughout the life science world. And I think that the life science world is huge. There's so many different parts here. I think that the first two goals that we're focused on are accelerating basic research and accelerating therapeutics development. In each of these things now we have more specific initiatives that we're starting. So for example, we recently started a wet lab where we're taking our model and our product and we're putting it to the test to try to see how can we maximally accelerate this particular field of research that we're choosing to pursue in metagenomics discovery. I think it's important for us to be dogfooding what we're building and trying it out and finding the limits and figuring out, helping us figure out where to point all of our model training efforts and product development, et cetera. And then on the drug development side, I could speak a bit more about this later, but we're trying to figure out, in addition to having this platform of the model and the product, what else do we need to do as a society to deflect the trajectory that we're on to alleviate the burden of disease and aging in a reasonable time frame? I don't want to get stuck claiming that we're going to cure all disease in X number of years, right? We can get stuck there for a long time. But I believe in Anthropic, we believe that amazing things are possible And we're certainly not going to cure all disease in the next 5 years or anything ridiculous like that, but we're really focused on how do we deflect this trajectory and get us on track for outcomes like that. And so we have all sorts of more specific things that we're getting going there.
Eric, I was hoping you were going to say AGI implies cure of all disease, but maybe it'll take a little bit longer than AGI. One follow-up on something you said, Eric, is could you help us understand, the class understand, what is the process start to finish for a drug to go to market? It sounds like there's a bunch of different phases, and maybe if you could, almost on the x-axis being time or median time for a drug, or pick an example if you'd like, and where in that process is AI, if at all?
Yeah, great question. So just to set the scene, on average, developing a drug end to end, from the moment you have the idea to the moment that you have FDA approval and it's on the market, takes about 10 to 15 years, something in that range, right? There are examples where it can happen faster, and I think the world record was closer to the 5-6 year mark, something like that, right? But that's the median outcome. So it takes a long time, and there are a lot of distinct steps in the process. I think one of my axes to grind is that when you look at the debate about what are the bottlenecks in drug development and where are the opportunities to pull time out, a lot of people are quick to say it's all in the clinical trials, right? Or it's all in the drug design. It's not all in any one of those things. It's distributed across, I'd say, 5 to 10 bottlenecks. So it's not an infinite number of bottlenecks. It's not hopeful, but it's also not just one thing. That's way overly simplistic. So if we walk through the process, the first step is, well, you have to decide what disease you're trying to cure in the first place. And once you have identified the disease and the patient population that you're trying to work in, you need to select a target. So the target is the molecule in the body that you want to develop a drug for. And you're saying with that you have a hypothesis that if I effectively drug this target, that it will be safe for the patient and it will cure the disease or be helpful, right? Mm-hmm. So the first step is identifying good targets, and there's a lot to say there. I think the first thing I'll highlight is that we have a big problem in the therapeutics industry that is referred to as target crowding, where if you look at in any given year, how many net new targets are pursued in the clinical phase by the whole therapeutics market in the whole world, it's on the order of about 30.
30. That's it.
So for that reason alone, we're not on track to cure all disease in any reasonable time frame if we're only going after 30 net new targets every year, right? So
and how many targets are there in total? What is the universe of targets? What's the TAM?
Many thousands, probably on the order of 10,000. So there's,
Got it.
This is overly simplistic, but there's 19,000 genes in the human genome. And so presumably any one of those could be a drug target, right? Not all of them will be, right? And you also you have one-to-many relationships, but certainly it's on the order of thousands.
So that's step one. And how much time budget of the 10-15 years has already been used up in this first part?
Well, actually, one of the somewhat pessimistic things is the clock doesn't really start until you've selected a target.
Okay, all right. Well,
but that's an important part of the whole process. Okay. And so once you've selected a target, then it's Josh's time to shine of actually developing the drug, right? And so you selected a target, and the next step is you have to figure out what type of drug am I going to develop? Will it be an antibody-based drug? Will it be a small molecule? Will it be one of these emerging modalities like molecular glues and other things, or a genetic medicine? So then you select the modality, and it's not obvious. Sometimes there's many choices that you can make, but then you actually have to design the drug, right? So this is the preclinical phase, where you're doing the fundamental science of trying to develop a drug that will bind your target and be safe for the patient, right? Not have off-target effects, and not only that, but be processed by the body in a reasonable way so that it doesn't get lost or converted into something else, et cetera. So this is, I think, what people would normally associate with the scientific phase of drug development, and this part. On average, takes about 4 years if you look historically, from selecting a target to starting clinical studies. And so this is the first thing I think a lot of people get wrong in saying that there's no opportunity here. There's huge opportunity here, and I think I imagine that you feel similarly. I think that we could take that 4 years down to near zero, right? In principle, in the theoretical limit, right? And I actually think that my own opinion is, it's not that important whether we get all the way to 0-shot drug design. 1 shot would be pretty good too. If you just ask the model for a drug and it gives you a few candidates, you do 1 round of testing, and a couple of weeks later you have your drug. That would be incredible, right? Compared to the 4 years that we're talking about. But I can let Josh elaborate on this. But even within the drug design phase, there's so many different parts, right? So you get your initial hit, which is like, we're just getting in the right ballpark. We can hit the target, right? And then after that, you do optimization to get to leads, right? And you're trying to get all these additional properties that you want related to how manufacturable is it? Does it have off-target effects? Is it stable in the body? Is it processed in the way that you expect, right? So there's all this optimization that you do that I think is really ripe for AI. But trying to accelerate this a little bit. So you design the drug, you have the drug candidate, and in the field, it's often referred to as a development candidate. So you have your development candidate, you lock your manufacturing processes, and you have to meet all sorts of pretty high bar for the rigor with which you're manufacturing this and documenting it, and then you're ready to start your clinical studies in humans. And so you have to get something called an IND from FDA in order to start these trials. And so then once you get the IND, then it's the clinical phase, and there are 3 parts of that. So there's a phase 1. This is historically, there's all sorts of variations that are possible, but there's a phase 1 focused on safety. Traditionally then a phase 2, that's your first look at efficacy. And then a phase 3, which is the final validation study that produces the evidence that your drug is safe and effective in humans, and that's the basis of the ultimate FDA clearance. In parallel as all that is happening, there's all sorts of work on the transfer to manufacturing side as well. So that's the whole process. If you'd say like the developing the drug is 4 years, then the clinical phase, right, everything up until the FDA period is something on the order of like 6 to 9 years or something like that, right? So that's how time is allocated. Cost is very much backloaded on the clinical phase. But I think there are really compelling and straightforward opportunities to use AI to pull time out of that process in both parts, on the preclinical phase and on the clinical side. But that's an overview. Yeah.
Super helpful. Thank you. Josh, you have clearly decided to focus your efforts on the part that you found to be the most high leverage. In this framework, where are you? Where's Chai's work? And how are you going to compress the timeline?
So I actually give 2 answers to this. I think Eric did a great job breaking down this into all these different phases, and creating a drug is so complicated. And one of the reasons why the pharma industry has so many of these different stages is that how do you even know if you're on track? You do have to break it down into a bunch of different mini games and win each of them. But at the end of the day, what we're really looking for is some molecular matter that actually modulates some kind of disease. That's what the process of making a drug is. And the high level, we have the preclinical phase, right, where we're trying to find that molecule, and the clinical, which is where we're trying to prove that it's going to work. But if we just think about it at a high level, it's finding a molecule that does something in a patient. And one of the things that's so powerful about AI is that these things really can be linked again, right? If I come up with a better and more potent molecule, hopefully that makes my clinical trial easier. One of the really sad things about the space right now is there's so many drugs that are extending lifespan by 1 month or 2 months or something like that. And again, for those patients that need it, that's amazing, right? And we should keep doing that work. But when you're looking at changes that small, clinical trials are really difficult, right? And being able to design a trial such that you can actually see that with statistical significance and get your drug approved is very difficult. If you have some amazing data, your trial becomes a lot easier all of a sudden. And I think we can actually look at code generation as a lens of what's possible here. If you look how people used LLMs for code gen even a year ago, you would get some initial solution, you would try to debug it, you'd put in some other LLM to ask some questions about it. It's a whole iterative process, and then eventually get some code that works. Now you can zero-shot an app, right? And I think that's what zero-shot drug discovery promises to potentially unlock. It's not just taking 4 years and getting it down to 0 years. I think it's also just about getting better medicines overall. We talked about targets and the TAM, right? And there's 30, a small number of targets that people crowd around. But 80% of named diseases don't have an approved medicine, right? And that's a huge problem here as well. So I think just creating better medicines, creating more medicines, that's what it all comes down to. So with all of that said, the place that Chai focuses in right now, because again, as you're building a startup, you need to focus somewhere. So we've started on that molecular generation process because we just see that as the apex for all of these other things that can happen around that. And one of the reasons why we're so excited about your work, for instance, is that if we can speed up the whole outer loop of right now those iteration cycles, then we can just get more shots on goal coming out of the model. But I think as both of these things get better, they're just going to reinforce one another. And I think the whole thing's going to be exponential in the next couple of years.
Fascinating. So the obvious question is why now? This is a problem as old as time. We've wanted to live forever. What has changed? What new technologies unlocked, and why is that going to compress now?
Well, so I've been trying to do this stuff my whole career, honestly. So you mentioned the story before, OpenAI to Facebook. And I think it's shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that AI has gotten a lot better. The model architectures have gotten to a point that they're a lot more scalable. A lot more compute has come online. Everything is just moving faster. And there's a lot of new data sets that we can build as well. And I think the other part of this too is that I think there's also a lot of willingness to experiment with these things. If you think about how Chai orients ourselves, right? We bring our models into pharmaceutical companies. There's also the other side of this, which is like you can build the thing, but people also need to be willing to experiment. And people are just really open to AI right now. But then B, there's also a lot of pressure. If you look at what's happening geopolitically in life sciences, and actually any of these pharma forums, and whenever I go to a conference about pharma, there's two topics these days. There's AI and there's China. And one of the things that the U.S. is struggling with right now is that China is just outrunning us when it comes to drug discovery.
How so?
They're just much more efficient. They work harder. It's cheaper to discover drugs there. So this is even on the preclinical side. Not to mention the clinical side. The regulatory state there, it's a lot easier to just get a drug into first in human in China. But one of the reasons why, if we just think about the U.S.'s role in biotech, we desperately need AI to work here because China can run faster than the U.S., but China cannot run faster than AI. And I think this is going to be a huge democratizing function in terms of our ability in the U.S. to actually come up with better drugs. So I think there's a lot of why now. There's both why now, and then also we really need it to work now. So we're kind of lucky that it's happening in terms of what's happening in the world.
Yeah. And is there a technology aspect to the why now for either of you that you might say hey, obviously the demand exists now because of AI and China, but has something changed? Have the large language models given us a leap forward? Is that a superpower? And what is the potency of that superpower in your estimation? Is this we're going to bring this down from 15 years to 15 minutes, or is it 15 years to 5 years? Help us size that.
Yeah, so I think by far my first answer to the why now is the existence and fast progress of large language models. I actually think that there's a few trends that are all converging right at the same time, and we're very fortunate because it didn't have to be the case. But it's the large language models is one. There's all sorts of other large models like Chai models, right? These foundation models, and they're complementary. Because as Josh said, the large language model I think of as the outer loop. It does what you do, right? As a human, you use Chai's model to get some designs, and you think about it, and you test them in the lab, right? And you keep iterating, right? And hopefully you don't need too many iteration cycles, right? But that whole process can now just be done by Claude. And it's getting better and better, right? So you have these two trends of the underlying foundation models are getting better, so you need fewer iterations in the first place, and you have the large language models that are available to do the outer loop and make that whole thing faster. So I think that's a strong trend, and I was giving an example of using these in the preclinical phase, but for the LLMs, the same thing I think can be said to some extent in the clinical phase as well. So that's one trend. The other trend that we're very fortunate that is happening right at the same time is the massive scale of data generation that's possible in biology, right? So we have all of these different measurement techniques that are becoming increasingly mature. Sequencing at this point is old news, but on top of that, right, we have single cell sequencing and proteomics and very high throughput techniques for measuring antibodies and all sorts of other assays that we're using to just keep fueling these. So I think these trends all happening at the same time is a big piece of it. As far as where the floor is, right, if we're in the 10 to 15 year zone, I think that we have clear line of sight to bringing the whole drug development timeline down to certainly the 5-year range, and I put that as an upper bound. I think you can imagine the whole thing happening in a few years. Ultimately, there are lower bounds that are going to be established by the duration of clinical trials. But here too, I think there's a lot more opportunity than people think for a few reasons, right? Like someone will point out, for example, let's say you're running a clinical trial to get at osteoporosis and other kind of classically you have to wait and see how many people's bones break over a certain period of time, and so to get enough statistical power you need to wait a year or something like that, right? And so that establishes naively this floor of a year for that clinical trial. But there are other methods that can in principle work. For example, if we can develop proxy measurements, right? If we take the right assays and we learn more about the biology and we can tell from all the things we're measuring about the body that the intended effect is happening, right? You can imagine having different endpoints for the clinical trials that bring the time down. And also, as Josh said, I think this is a really important point, the larger effect sizes in the first place. So the number of subjects that you have to enroll depends on the effect size. And the more effective the drugs are, the fewer subjects and the faster the whole thing can go. So that's where I back into that time estimate.
Yeah. Historically, there has been framing in life sciences of either you're developing the full drug and selling the drug and enjoying the revenue that comes from selling the drug, or being a tool, or you're selling a tool, right? And at least most traditional biotech investors will value life sciences businesses as the, call it, revenue stream or free cash flow coming from their drugs, forecasted back to today and have some discounted cash flow of it, and that's your market cap or the valuation that VCs are willing to pay. You have decided to build a platform of tools that you'll be selling to these people, and it sounded like, Eric, you said wet lab. You're going to build a wet lab. So does that imply you're going to develop the full drug and monetize the drug at Anthropic?
Yeah, good question. I should correct that misconception. So no, that is not our plan to develop drugs. We also are very much building tools that we want the rest of the industry to use. The purpose of our wet lab, so I've been talking a lot about drug development, but our other primary objective is to accelerate basic research, right, as an end in itself. And so the wet lab is our sandbox for pursuing that goal. So we actually have a basic research team that is just doing science, putting our tools to the test and maximizing use of Claude through everything that you can imagine. And so the wet lab does serve a different purpose.
Gotcha. So one of the biggest things that we talk about in this class is where will value accrue in AI? Certainly so far, a lot of that has been in the semiconductors layer and not as much as got into the app layer. In your world in biology, historically that has been at the layer that is selling the drugs, not at the tools. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're both building tools and probably have a reason to believe it's going to be different this time. Why might it be different this time?
I can give the simplest answer to this is that the tools are becoming more valuable than they've ever been before. If you look at where value has accrued historically, the drugs that we have today on the market are extremely primitive. It's honestly a miracle at all that we can discover drugs with the tools that are available to us today. People often ask Chai who our competitors are, and it's literally the yeast and the mice and the traditional tools in the lab that are being used. And the drugs these days are as simple as trying to jam up a target, for instance, on a cell. And they have all these side effects, and most drugs are they have many off-target effects that they probably shouldn't have. So I think as the tools become more powerful, it makes sense that more value should accrue there. Why should you pay that much for a tool that doesn't impact your probability of success? If everything that we're talking about here, if what Eric is saying, comes to pass and timelines go down, probability of success goes up, then by adopting these AI tools, if you're a pharmaceutical company, for instance, you should probably start trading at a higher multiple. Because if your probability of success goes up and your cost goes down for getting things to market and the timelines go down, already just by adopting these tools, you become more valuable, and therefore a lot of value should accrue to the tool makers. And the tools are just way more scalable than actually the end products as well.
Yeah, one of the other things that we observed is the largest biotech companies in the West were founded decades, if not centuries ago. They're in the 20th century, there's a couple in the 19th century, and there's a couple of them that were formed in the last 25 years. Do you think one of the impacts might be more democratization, more startup forming because the tools are so accessible?
I think it can go in, there's going to be a couple of second order effects here. So the first thing is today you could start a biotech company just by being a little bit more efficient than a pharmaceutical company. Pharma companies are built big organizations, and there might be some target insight that you get out of Claude, right? And then you rush a molecule to clinical trials, you get some proof of concept in a patient, and then a pharma company buys you up. What happens when 2 years from now you can just zero shot that molecule and you can zero shot a biotech, right? I think, does that mean biotech goes away? I don't actually think that happens. I think biotech just evolves around that. The same way today, if you can zero shot an app, you can't just sell a tool that's as simple as, that zero shot. You need to figure out either some other mode or some more complex software that has bigger value. So I think it's very hard to predict what's going to happen here because, again, this is happening exponentially. There's a lot going on at once. There's a lot of second order effects. So I think on the balance, if everything stays stagnant, you might see accumulation to the incumbents. But in reality, people are always going to find new opportunities. There's going to continue to be startups, and the outcomes will just be bigger than they've ever been before because we have better tools to make these things happen.
Fascinating. You guys have a very special vantage point, and you probably know all that's on the frontier of development. What are the biggest unsolved problems in your fields right now that you're looking forward to being solved with either the models or otherwise?
Yeah, I think there's a few that I would highlight. So the first is what companies like Chai have done for antibody development. I think doing that in other modalities is very much an unsolved problem, right? So antibodies are probably the most effective class of drug right now, but there are plenty of targets and diseases for which antibodies aren't immediately applicable. So we have small molecules and these other modalities that are emerging. And I'm really excited about taking these modalities. The way I like to think about this is there's a certain frontier of targets that are druggable today with our current methods, right? And we need to advance that and turn those into engineering disciplines, right? In the way that antibody design has gone from what used to be, somewhat more like an alchemical craft into more of an engineering discipline. And so I think that is well within reach with AI, but is a hard, important problem to work on. And the other thing that I would highlight is scaling up the discovery of high quality new targets. So again, we're still crowding around a relatively small number of targets. And I think as a field, we're all trying to figure out what's that next big scalable way that we can unlock a huge number of high quality new targets to pursue. And there are a lot of efforts going on here, for example, in virtual cell and cell perturbation models, which is this new technique that is emerging, and more traditional genetics-based approaches for looking at human genetics data at the population scale and correlating it with health records. But I think that's a really important frame of, as a society, we need a scalable way to find many, many more good targets.
Yeah. Anything you'd add to that, Josh?
I mean, I fully agree with those. Maybe the one last one I would add is more sophisticated medicines. So I kind of alluded to this before, but a lot of the drugs today are very simple. And I think as we get more control over them, you can think about, one of the things we do with Chai is we can fold up a lot of the proteins in the drugs that we're designing. So think of this almost as like an atomic level microscope of like what's going on in your system. And if you have that, you can now start to dream a lot bigger with the kind of molecules that are possible. So I think this is something that's also going to play out.
Makes sense. The productivity of a big unlock in your field is incredibly high. There are companies that have single drugs that have led to hundreds of billions of revenue, certainly many in the tens of billions of dollars of range. Is there a program or two that you guys are watching that you're like, hey, this is going to be the next GLP level success, or has the potential?
Yeah, good question. I would highlight there's some emerging targets coming out around increasing lean muscle mass that I just think from a commercial perspective, I'm making no comment on the value to society, but
the Incredible Hulk.
But I will say I think there are some really important medical use cases for those. But that aside, if there's a drug that you can take that makes you ripped, I think that's going to do pretty well.
My team is going to kill me for saying this, but this is actually our internal joke at Chai as well. If you look at like Renaissance, Rentec, for instance, they have their internal medallion fund. So one of the ways you get compensated if you go to Renaissance is you get to put money in like the best performing fund. So we're all like, we should, if we ever make drugs at Chai, we should start with that. And it's just for Chai employees. So you come to Chai, you get jacked, and
Nice. Any that you're looking at, Josh?
I think that things for sleep are going to be really interesting as well. So I think what the GLP-1s and the obesity drugs are showing us, they're almost like consumer medicine essentially because of how big the patient populations are. And I think sleep is also something that leads to so many of the disorders that are out there. So if we can find ways for people to like sleep better or get rid of sleep disorders, I think that's also interesting. And actually, as a similar kind of economics, if you will, to the GLP-1s, it started with diabetes and kind of moved to obesity. And same thing here. You can start with sleep disorders, and then maybe that turns into like, I don't know, if I can sleep more effectively, like who wouldn't want a drug like that?
Yeah.
So I think this might be the start of these like consumer medicines and really change the way that we live.
Fascinating. Wow, those are two pretty remarkable ones. Everybody in the class is wondering what should we go invest in for getting ripped and sleeping better. Maybe we'll start with you, Josh. Pick a business, pick a business or idea or startup that you're bullish on, based on everything you know about the world. And the other way, what are you skeptical of, which you think is more hype than reality?
Yeah, the two categories I'd point to first, I mean, shouldn't be a surprise, like pharmaceuticals, like if we're going to have better drugs, then you can almost think of many pharma companies almost as like capital aggregators, right? They have these drugs that are creating billions of revenue. They have a mandate to reinvest that into more drugs, and they might just become way more effective. Another thing also, and I just want to give this a little bit more contrarian, but is actually lab experiments themselves. So a lot of people, when they talk to us, they assume that like, oh, Chai wants to like make experiments dead or something like that. But I actually think if you can design your experiments better, the ROI in the experiments goes up. So I think it's going to be a Jevons paradox actually for a lot of lab work, where we go into this renaissance where, and we can actually pull like Dario's remarks, right, from the incredible essays that imagine like 10 years of biomedical discoveries happening in the next year. It's going to be a lot of lab work for that to happen, right? And AI is going to be driving it, so hopefully a lot more of like, Chai usage as well to make that happen and cloud usage. So those are the things I'm most excited about.
Yeah. Anything you're bearish on?
I'd be bearish, actually. So I mentioned these things are kind of in the physical world, right? Yeah. The things I'd be more bearish on are things that are purely in the software world, but are not frontier. So for instance, a lot of the methods that are used today in the bio world, there's actually, people have been using like physics-based methods and computational-based methods for a long time in drug discovery. There's companies that have been around for 30 years, and they've had tremendous impact in this space. But AI is becoming quite powerful and is going to eat a lot of that stuff as well. So I guess you could summarize this as like, AI in the physical world is going to be really big. But you want to think about how to combine these things together.
Makes sense. Over to you, Eric.
Yeah,
short.
So my category for long is similar to what Josh said at the end. I'm very excited about this class of companies that make it possible for Claude to run experiments. So there's two ways for Claude to be able to run experiments. One way would be to hook up Claude to lab instruments and work through all those integrations, and we're absolutely working on that. But Claude can run experiments right now by just placing orders with contract research organizations or CROs, right? Claude, what would I do if I wanted to do that? I would draft a protocol and I would email somebody and we'd talk back and forth. Claude can do that right now. And is doing that right now. And so these aren't quite CROs, but these are what I would call the class of business that I'm really excited about are these really scalable sort of AI native, real lab, wet lab companies, right? That are manufacturing materials or running experiments with high scale in a way that is easy for AI to interface with, right? So some examples of companies that I think are great in this space, Plasmid on all sorts of sequencing that you want to get done, and Adaptive and Twist, right? These are companies that make it really easy to do these things at scale and execute, phenomenally well on the wet lab part. So that's a class of things that I'm excited about.
Awesome. Things that you're skeptical on?
Yeah, so I have maybe a kind of generic comment here, and it might sound strange with two people that have a business selling tools to companies that are doing therapeutics, but I'm generally bearish on companies with business models that are reliant on selling tools to pharma. Now, obviously, you can make big businesses successful there, but I think it's very hard. There's very few examples of groups that have been successful doing that compared to just doing the thing itself, right? The barriers to actually going and starting to develop drugs have never been lower and are coming dramatically down, to the point where we like to call it pipeline in a person. You could have a single person using lots and lots of Claude and foundation models actually running a portfolio of early stage drug programs, right? And soon I think that frontier will advance so that a relatively small team can be running several clinical stage programs. So I'm just highlighting, of course you can build great businesses on the tools model, but I think that path is really, really hard. And alternatively, I think democratizing actually developing therapeutics in itself is just getting easier and easier and more accessible.
Wow, what a savage response. You're making sure nobody starts a competitor. Do not compete with this guy. Okay. You guys have a phenomenal setup, as you said, very, very special spot. What would you be doing if you were not doing this? What's your next best idea? Asking for a friend who's not going to start a competitor to Anthropic.
Well, I think the first thing I would be doing is what I said at the end, trying to run a bunch of drug programs as efficiently as possible. Because I already said that, I would throw out one more, which I think figuring out how to connect AI to the wet lab is a big frontier also, right? So today, Claude can run experiments by communicating with CROs. That's great for today, but we'll reach a whole new level of efficiency when Claude can actually directly interface with lab instruments, right? And I think...
So like instrumenting it, giving it the arms and legs to run experiments.
Yes, exactly. And I think there's a lot of parts to this problem. There's the hardware layer, there's the kind of software protocol communication layer on top of that. But it feels to me like there's something productizable there to do.
Fascinating. That's almost like a programmable chemistry.
Yes, exactly. Like the kind of, lab in the box. Like, you plug this thing in and all of a sudden Claude can, control your wet lab.
Is there an instantiation of this? Is there evidence of a business that looks like this?
I think there are a number of companies that are pursuing, mostly startups that are pursuing things like this. But I think it's the early days, we're maybe a year or two into what I expect to be a many-year journey.
Got it. This sounds more promising than an Anthropic competitor. What about you, Josh?
I think actually very close to that. It's like, how do you actually set up autonomous drug programs, right? I think the dream will be how far, it's almost, you should think of it as an eval even, of like, hey, can we actually come up with a set of benchmarks and see how far can the models push on each of these things? And I think that converges into, okay, at some point the models get past a certain mark where they've done something really useful. So I think you'd even take the frontier problems in drug discovery, many of which we've talked about here, and then you would keep putting the frontier agents on them, and then eventually you'll get some breakthrough and you try to push that to market as soon as possible. One of the interesting things about pharma is it's one of the most competitive industries that's out there, right? Because if you think about what these companies are trying to do, they're trying to treat disease, right? And many of it's not obvious how to treat a disease or even, doing the commercial work of like which is the best to go after just because it's so complicated, but like treating disease is like the most obvious business model, most obvious business case. That's actually one of the reasons why I got so excited about this stuff. Like a lot of friends in college were like, what's the next snapshot to build? And what's the best company? I'm like, guys, there's a lot of disease out there, right? Why don't we just try to treat that? That's got to be valuable to folks. So I think just writing these things down and then just seeing how far can the models get there, and then just being able to be the first to do that is probably the other most interesting thing to do. You want to be first in class, and people often say best in class, but being last in class is something else someone mentioned to me recently, which I think is a really exciting concept.
Fascinating. We'll open it up for questions if folks have any. Oh, here we go. Go ahead.
So I come from a pharma background, small molecules, polymer drug delivery. You hear a lot about discovery. You hear nothing about development. Can you elaborate on why you think that is from your vantage points and what the opportunities might be?
Yeah, I think there are a few reasons for that. So first, the opportunities in discovery are pretty straightforward. They're hard to execute on, but I think everyone who looks at it can name what they are. The opportunities in development, it's not any one or two super compelling, easy things. I think it's also a lot of things that aren't obviously blocked by model intelligence, but are sort of operational, and you need to have all the right connections in place. So my opinion is that first, it's less glamorous to begin with, and it's less obvious, and it's less obviously related to model intelligence. I would put all those together. I also think the AI community, tending to be more scientific in nature, has less experience with that phase of things, and I think that plays into it. As far as what the opportunities are, I think there are many. So going through a few of the ones that I'm excited about are optimizing patient recruitment, right? So you can imagine using AI to be intelligent about site selection and looking at prevalences and enrollment and things like that, and making sure that you're choosing the right sites and enrolling patients as quickly as possible. There's the trial administration side of things, where right now there's a lot of operational overhead that goes into site monitoring and entering and checking records in the electronic database and all that. So that should all be automated like right away, and something that Claude should do. And on top of that, I think there's the more scientific components. This is where discovery and development interact. Well, you want to make sure that the trial has a higher probability of success in the first place, and you want to make sure that the effect size is as large as possible. So those are, I think, two very significant opportunities that relate more to the discovery side, actually. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I had a question. So I guess there are two questions here, but there's talk about these training runs getting bigger. Like now we're in the $1 billion phase, we'll go to 10 billion, possibly 100 billion. What would that unlock on like everything you're doing? Like when we think about LLMs, it's like, well, you give it a book and then you mask out like a paragraph and it learns to fill it in. But what is that equivalent for the models that you're trying to build? And if you can do $100 billion training run, like what would that unlock? I know it's a really general question, but.
Yeah, so I think there's a steady stream of model improvements with every model generation. And so the way that I think about it is there's just certain capabilities that we're targeting. And as we do more training, the capabilities get better, and sometimes there are scale effects where there are capabilities that are kind of flat. You don't have them at all, and then at a certain scale they start turning on. And so, just to give a few examples, like we found that our models didn't understand much about proteins for a while, right? And then with Opus 4.6 for the first time, we started to see that the models were starting to learn more about proteins, right? And that has to do with things that we're doing in training and the size and all sorts of things like that. But I think those are kind of the two trends that are happening here, of the incremental improvement in many different capabilities, and then also the scale effects that we've seen throughout many domains, even outside of the life sciences and AI, where sometimes you just don't see something until a certain model generation in the first place.
Go ahead.
Even in software, single shotting works very well for called shallow stacks like web services and so on. But our experience has been that it does not work well at all for deep stacks like databases and distributed systems. And biology seems like the very extreme of that deep stack. What kind of applications do you foresee single shotting actually working?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think part of this is a question of how challenging the task is that we can go after, right? And that the frontier will just keep getting pushed there. So what you said about not being able to zero shot a database, I mean, I don't even know if that's true anymore. I wouldn't be surprised if you guys have already achieved that, right? And I think the same thing applies in biology. A lot of people, it's funny, when we started the company, one of our investors did a lot of work for us, like kind of doing all the expert networks and saying, hey, like how much would you pay for this sort of thing? And people were like, oh, we wouldn't pay much for like, zero shotting a molecule. And they're like, why? And they're like, because it doesn't work. Like, why would I pay for it? And they're like, no, let's assume it works. And they're like, it's impossible. And they're like, okay, so it looks like we're onto something, right? So I think a lot of these things, it's more a question of, I think that's what's so exciting in AI right now. You really can dream big. It is possible that what the stuff I have up on the slide over here just like is not possible, right? We don't know, but you see scaling laws for these things. And as you build more data sets, as you bring on more compute, they start to come in reach. So I think it's more a question of like when rather than if. But to be honest, we don't know for sure. And I think that's part of the adrenaline that comes along with building in this space.
But it seems like the loop has to have testing regulation. It's like it's the mega Ralph loop, so to speak.
Yeah, I think actually it relates to the last question too. I think one of the reasons why you hear a lot more of like AI in discoveries because the feedback loops are shorter. So for instance, if it's in clinical development, it's like, okay, are we going to go do a whole clinical trial with AI? That might take a long time versus just to design a molecule and test it in the lab. You can do that in a couple weeks.
Awesome. Well, everybody's going to be single-shotting the drug to get ripped and sleep better. We're going to wrap it here, guys. Feel free to come find them downstairs. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.